everyone. I'm Gary Null, and I'd like to welcome you to our program. For the thousands of new listeners coming in just the last 2 weeks, we look for the truth. There's no ideology, no political party, no religion. No, we're looking at what allows us to live a longer and healthier life and how to properly and appropriately and with peace approach change in our lives and as a society. And I'm going to deal with all that today. I'm going to be sharing some insights on how we can and should change. And also we're going to have the gentleman who calls himself the old doctor in the chair. He, I believe, was practicing for around 50 years. He's a highly respected medical doctor, board certified. And now he just is like a muse. He sits in a rocking chair and very casually gives us his input. Whether you agree or disagree in part or whole, more often than not, he has the full truth on his side. If you're old enough to remember Will Rogers, one of America's great just thematic thinkers, he could take any theme in life and come up with a folksy, down-home, homespun way of understanding it, where it made sense. He's going to tell us about the nasal swab today, and what is a medical doctor just doesn't make a lot of sense to him. We're also going today to hear about what about the administrations, both the left and the right, Republican and Democrat, approaching us, we the citizens, as if we're a member of a cult, and therefore telling us what we have to do, must do, should do, in order to obey their rules about COVID. Well, what if what we're doing is really acting as if we're a member of a cult? And therefore we're going to be learning from C.J. Hopkins, the COVIDian cult. That'll be interesting, because I have my own observations about that. Also want to mention that we have a brand new website. It's vaccination.net. All one word, vaccination.net. And since they're trying to ban, and are, on Facebook and Google and other sites, Twitter, any mention of COVID that could be critical, or of the lockdown, of the PCR test, of the nasal swab, of the expensive medicines, of the respirators they're using, of the vaccines, you're not allowed to criticize them on any level. But you're not allowed to criticize vaccines either. So what we're doing is we're taking a look and we're trying to show you the truth. And we have several other articles beyond the 50 plus that I've written. Instead, we have Barbara Fisher and all of her articles, Robert Kennedy Jr.'s Children's Health Defense and his. We read the other articles, we make sure they're accurate and scientifically valid, then we post them. So at least you're not getting conspiracy theories or ones that are just, that are not grounded in truth. So now you can read all you want. There's hundreds of articles. Go to vaccination.net. Plus there are films, documentaries, there are books, and there are resources for you. So that's something that's also new and important. Today, we're going to begin our program, as we do every day, with things that empower us. This is from the University of West of Scotland, and it's an interesting story because it talks about nitrate-rich beets, and it creates nitric oxide in the body, which helps the blood get through the veins and arteries easier. It creates a certain, let's say, amplification of the ability to dilate, meaning opening up. You don't want closed veins. You don't want closed arteries. You don't want that kind of very thick blood from eating an unhealthy, fat-laced and meat-based diet. When you have a glass of orange juice or a glass of beet juice, and it's easy to make beet juice, you just take beets, clean them, you can peel them, and juice them. Very tasty. I always put some lemon and lime juice in my beet juice, but I have a 12-ounce glass of beet juice about every day. And it helps the blood. It's rich in iron, and the type of iron that comes from vegetables, which is easier for the body to assimilate and utilize, and it's not toxic. But there have been a lot of calls to help athletes who are on high carbohydrate diets, and they end up with exercise-induced dehydration and transient problems with their immune function because they're not getting in the right nutrients. Well, in comes the beets, and eating beets or eating beet juice or even fermented beets are great, pickled beets. But because then you're getting the probiotics and prebiotics. But if you're a runner, a jogger, a biker, an aerobic exerciser, then a glass of beet juice is just what you need because it can help you, helps your blood. Also, from Aarhus University in Denmark comes a study about fermented red clover extract. It stops menopausal hot flashes and symptoms. I did a study about 15 years ago. I met every week for a year with 500 women, all of whom had hot flashes, dry skin, thinning of the hair, thinning of the outer eyebrows, slowing down of the thyroid gland, hormone imbalance, night sweats, fatigue, vaginal dryness, brittle nails, and about a dozen other conditions that we commonly call menopause. Well, by changing their diet and their lifestyle, we were able to reverse in 93% of these women all of these inconvenient changes, made things positive again. By the way, when I say positive, things such as this: women whose hair was thinning, many were wearing wigs. Within a year, they had a whole new crop of hair, thick and lusterful as it was earlier in life, and returned to its natural color. That's terrific. At least one-third of the women said that they no longer could experience pleasurable intercourse with their partner because their vagina had dried out, in effect, didn't have the same mucus for lubrication. And therefore it was painful and it was dangerous because they could bleed and be infected. Now they had completely rehydrated their body and they had normal secretions. So they returned to normal sexual activity with their partners. We had women who, one woman had a fungus toe, she said, for 4 years. Toenails came back pink and hard and shiny instead of cracked and brittle and dry. Another woman said that she was so fatigued each day, she had to drink 10 cups of coffee. Now she could go right through the day because she had her energy back, her thyroid gland. These are just some of the things that happen. But one of the things that they got was fermented miso. The primary miso I gave them, which is a low-sodium miso, was to take you buy them in a health food store. It's a little, like 1 pound, more or less, a bottle or a little tub of miso. It can come from brown rice. It can come from chickpeas, and chickpeas is a light kind of yellow miso. And you take a teaspoon to a tablespoon of that. You put it in some hot water. Put in some diced scallions or onions, shiitake mushrooms, reishi mushrooms, or French mushrooms, oyster mushrooms, as many as you can, and then some sliced garlic and some seaweed, kombu, wakame, hajiki, nori. And that makes a great, great broth. It's loaded with probiotics. It's anti-cancer. It's immune enhancing. And by the way, some variation of that is consumed throughout the southeast part of the world, China, South Korea, going clear through Indonesia and Japan. We're not used to that in this country. In fact, it's very common in some of these countries to start your day with a bowl of miso with tofu in it and different types of starchy vegetables. So that's very good, but we also was suggesting red clover. Now what's important is this Danish study shows that fermented red clover extract stops menopausal hot flashes. So that's just something else we can add. I also suggested Vitex, Vitex, dong quai, pho thai, passion flower, also for helping, along with Siberian ginseng, to help if you have hot flashes. But this is now another scientifically confirmed benefit. Another study, and this is from McMaster's University and the University of Toronto, published in the British Medical Journal just today, showed that a high intake of refined grains, that would mean rice and wheat, for example, and barley, when you refine them, you take away the fiber, you take away the endosperm, you take away the vitamins and minerals, you're left with really a lower fiber, nutritional deficient starch. But if you have the unrefined grains, the brown rice, the quinoa, the spelt, but with all the nutrients intact, that's healthy. But if you eat a lot of your grains refined, you're at a higher risk of dying from heart disease and overall death. Now consider that around the world, depending upon the culture, a lot of people will eat foods closer to their natural state, where they don't peel everything off, boil everything to death. They, especially in cultures where they eat a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, that's terrific. A lot of seaweed, that's good. And foods that are rich in protein from vegetable sources like tempeh and tofu, lots of nuts and seeds. But when it comes to the grains in America, for the last 150 years, we've primarily been eating refined grains. In fact, there was a farm that I looked at, and there was a grinding stone. It was about 2 feet across, about 8 inches thick, and there was a smoother stone on the bottom and a rougher stone on top, and there was a handle, and you turn it, and as you turned it, and these were in circles, two circles, one on top of the other, and there was a hole in the middle, and you would pour your whole grain in there, and it would grind it all up. And that's how they did it. And that was upstate New York, at a farm that I bought, the Fertile Farm. And by the way, I tried to use the tools that they would have used in the 18 and 1900s. I didn't use any modern tools. So if something needed to be built, it was built with the old tools. A window cracked, use the old tools. It took a lot more time. It was a lot harder, but it was a very powerful learning experience, one that I really appreciated. And a lot of people came up on the weekends from the city in the summer. In fact, I could accommodate 50 people, and every single weekend for 14 years, as long as I owned the place, it was packed. And people come up on Sunday. Sometimes we'd have 200 or 300 people bring their family up, and I'd make a huge meal for everyone. There'd be like 10, 20 different items to select from, and we just had the time of our lives. It was like a family reunion. But we would teach people how to make tofu, how to grow. In fact, whatever was in the garden that was extra, I would give it to people, and they could take home with them as a gift. And a lot of people got into a more healthy movement back in the early 1970s. But we had a different mindset back then. That's when communes were down in Tennessee, and the different places around Hippocrates was going on with Anne Wigmore up in Boston, where she was having people come and drink lots of wheatgrass juice and cleanse their system. She was a wonderful human being. She would later live on my farm for 2 years when her place burned down. And I was visited by people, well, mind you, I'm in my 20s, and I got people in their 70s who would come and visit who were part of the natural hygiene movement. It was one of the most important experiences of my life, where everything was new and exciting. And I remember on Fridays I would go up early from the city, and it was near New Paltz, about an hour and 45 minutes, and I would spend the afternoon pulling out poison ivy, poison sumac, and poison oak, so nobody got themselves infected. Then making sure there were no copperheads or rattlesnakes, which they tend to do, go under houses and whatnot. And the whole afternoon just cleaning and prepping, and so when the people came that evening, it would be a nice, wonderful experience for the next 2 days, which it was. But we had a stone grinding apparatus there. So they actually got to see it, and I made a water wheel. So they could actually see how people used to get, water and the water coming through, dropping from bucket to bucket to bucket, going in a circle, could then generate the power that would turn a stone grinding machine. It was, and I had found that up in Vermont and brought it back. I'd go around on the weekends or had friends who would be out traveling and they'd call me and say, hey, we found this old apparatus. I miss those days. So, but the takeaway message was, eat your grains in their whole food way if you want to live a longer and healthier life, because you will, versus the refined. A study out of Harvard Medical School, as well as the University of Tromsø in Norway, found that higher vitamin D levels is linked to longer telomeres. Now, earlier in the week, I mentioned that in the anti-aging discussions that the choices we make in life will directly impact whether our telomeres, which are the proteins, the end caps of chromosomes, much like a shoelace, that little plastic thing that keeps your shoelace from unraveling, that's a telomere on a chromosome. When they get shorter and shorter by dividing, then the cell is going to be exposed and dies. So you want those to stay longer. When you exercise, it stays longer. When you take in a good diet, it stays longer. When you're de-stressed, it lasts longer. Now, the Harvard Medical School found that increasing levels of vitamin D are associated with longer telomeres, and that's a major biological marker for your aging process. This was published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Nutrition. And finally, when you combine the anthocyanins, let's say from grapes, and bromelain, and which you can get from the core of pineapples. Most people throw it away. You shouldn't. You can. Now, it's very pithy, very thick, very dense. It's not chewy like the flesh of a pineapple. But if you throw it in a blender and you blend it up, then drink that down in a smoothie, that improves the endothelial function, the inside arteries and veins lining, and it's good for your skeletal muscles. It oxygenates the tissue, and that's good, according to the University of Nebraska. So, grapes and pineapple, two things you can take each day, and that improves lowering blood pressure, it improves endothelial function, it improves oxygen capacity, all good. And it's scientifically shown. Oh, and by the way, University of Texas had a study published in the International Journal of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity showing that school gardens are linked with kids eating more vegetables. I believe that every school in America can grow a garden. You can have rooftop gardens. You can, have outdoor gardens. If space is available, of course. Even if space is not immediately available, why not get some buildings that are in disrepair that have to be torn down and get the city to clear off a lot and make that into a children's school gardens where they can learn how to grow. Now, I went down to New Orleans because I heard there was a guy after COVID who went in there, was helping people. And I asked, what's his name? They didn't know. But they knew that he drove a bus, a school bus that he had converted. And so, I went into the lower Ninth Ward. Lower meaning it's below sea level, about 8 foot below. And by the way, you can see, as you drive around there, you can see the whole area is got a watermark at that level. In any case, I found a school bus, and there he was. And he had taken all these old buildings and converted them in the lots beside him into his community gardens. They were growing everything. There was a long line of people on a Saturday waiting to get their bags of fresh produce that were growing. So we can do this. We can grow food, let children see how it's grown, teach them about the importance of growing organically, locally. Just something to think about. That's the latest on health and healing. We are 20 minutes into our program. We're going to take a break and come right back with the good doctor giving us his wisdom on nasal swabs.
We all know now, well, those of us with functioning brain tissue know that the PCR tests are useless for finding cases of COVID-19, but very good indeed at helping governments keep us in our own homes under house arrest. In some parts of the world, the PCR tests are regarded as utterly useless. I explained precisely what's wrong with these misused tests in a previous video, subtly called "The PCR test is useless for COVID-19, but useful for crooked governments." The big problem, of course, is that the British government, for example, deliberately ignores the WHO guidelines and does the test in a crooked way, which would, in a just and sensible world, result in Boris Johnson, Madge Hancock and the rest of their advisors being crowded into the dock. You'd get just as good a result if you divided people into two groups, those with a vowel in their surname and those without a vowel, and then announced that the ones with the vowel all had COVID-19 and the rest all needed to change their names within 7 days or pay a huge fine. So, everyone with brain tissue knows that the PCR test is useless, except for political reasons, and that the whole testing program is an outrageously expensive and disruptive shambles. Only government ministers, scientific advisors and pseudo-journalists at the wretched and treacherous BBC think that PCR tests are valuable. Did you know, by the way, that the government's allegedly hired 900 consultants to help with the test and trace scheme? Her consultants are said to be being paid £1,000 a day, though what they do for that I can't imagine. That's £900,000 a day, and I rather suspect that 99.99% of the population would be happier if the £900,000 a day was spent on dentists. But that's not the half of it. Most people seem to have accepted the need for regular PCR testing. Indeed, people in the UK queue up to have it done as often as possible, as though they get some sort of thrill out of having a complete stranger stuff something into a bodily orifice, pushing it in as far as it'll go, twizzling it about a bit and then pulling it out and buggering off without so much as a "thank you very much, I'll give you a ring tomorrow and we'll have dinner and perhaps do it again." There's talk of children having daily tests, though I haven't been able to find any evidence that this would be a good idea for anyone other than the hugely profitable industry now involved in making and looking at the swabs. What no one ever mentions is that the PCR tests are dangerous and can, if done improperly, cause excruciating pain. This is probably why some countries don't seem very keen. There is indeed a great deal of confusion about how far in the swab should go. I say maybe we should call it the Klaus swab, the geezer from the Economic Forum. In Australia, the guidelines are that the swab should go a few centimetres up the nostril. But nasopharyngeal swabs can go much further. The United States Department of Health and Human Services says that the swab should reach a depth equal to the distance from the nostrils to the outer opening of the ear. Try it, that's a huge distance. In Ottawa, Canada, the recommendation is half that distance. In October last year, I reported on a case where a healthy individual had noticed cerebrospinal fluid pouring out of her nose after an invasive PCR test. This really is not something you want happening. The woman concerned, who was in her 40s, had a PCR nasal swab test and later went to see a doctor complaining of vomiting, a runny nose and headache and a stiff neck. The pseudo-journalists at the BBC can, if they're interested, find the details in the Journal of American Medical Association, Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery. That's a journal for the people at the BBC who might think it's a brand of soap. Surgeons found that the fluid running down her nose was cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid that protects the brain. Then there was a case which was accepted for the Medical Journal of Australia on the 4th of December. I'm not sure whether it's been published yet, but it's been accepted. This reported a healthy 67-year-old woman who had cerebrospinal fluid coming down her nose and the symptoms of meningitis. This followed a COVID-19 swab test. How many people are being killed, especially in care homes, by this wretched and useless test? The authors of the paper I've just quoted stated that the, open quotes, techniques for deep nasal and nasopharyngeal swabs may be easily confused, close quotes. They offer instructions for people doing the swab tests. Here's one part of their instructions, open quotes. It involves swab insertion into the nasal cavity at a plane between the opening of the nose and the external ear canal on the patient, which can be considered as the horizontal plane for the purpose of relationships to surface anatomy. This will allow the swab to be inserted parallel to the nasal floor, which would avoid injury to the middle turbinates. Swabs inserted in an upward orientation into the nasal cavity, greater than 30 degrees, not only have a risk of failing to achieve an adequate diagnostic sample from the desired nasal mucosa in nasopharynx, but also puts the patient at greater risk of injury to the thin and delicate areas of the skull base, attachment of middle turbinate and cribriform plate, which is superior and anterior to the sphenoid sinus ostium. Close quotes. There's then an illustration for swabbing, and the authors conclude, open quotes, we urge that this angle is not exceeded when performing diagnostic tests, as it places the patient at greatest risk of serious adverse events, close quotes. Might I suggest that if you're having a PCR test, you should make sure that the person doing the PCR test has studied these instructions, understood them, and is going to follow the instructions very carefully. In Saudi Arabia, an 18-month-old child died after a test swab broke inside his nasal cavity. These are all, as always with my videos, these are in medical journals and can easily be found. These are not safe tests. Children are being traumatized by these incredibly invasive tests. They're not safe, and they're very often being done by people who know as much about medicine and human anatomy as I know about running a submarine. Though I have to say, I have seen Ice Station Zebra with Patrick McGurk twice, and that film, I've seen that film with Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington. That was a submarine. And then there was Red October with Sean Connery. Actually, when you come to think of it, I probably know more about submarines than the average test and tracer tester knows about anatomy. Quite a few things have puzzled me about the PCR test. First, why the devil do they have to push the swab so far up your nose and so close to your brain? Where is the indisputable scientific evidence that all the little COVID-19 bugs are gathering up there for some reason? Do they like that out-of-the-way place? Normally, if you have a bug up your nose, it'll be up your nose. Where's the solid proof that the test only works if a sample's taken from a spot so far up your nose that the tissue up there probably speaks another language and only gets home once a year? Since these tests are now being performed by people who aren't doctors or nurses or probably even Boy Scouts, we need some evidence that the test is essential. Actually, since the tests produce more false positives than real positives, they're clearly a waste of time anyway. And it would make as much sense if the testing swab were inserted into the umbilicus and given a good twizzle there. Second, and this is crucially important, and you must listen carefully to this. Second, researchers at Johns Hopkins University in the United States have published a very interesting study. They've developed a tiny star-shaped micro-device capable of delivering a drug. The device, no larger than a speck of dust, contains a metal core coated in heat-sensitive paraffin wax, and at the center of the core there is the drug. Now, we have to be aware that half of Americans are reluctant to have the COVID-19 vaccination. Very wisely, I think. And we have also to be aware that this hidden injection technology could be used to deliver a vaccine as well as any other drug. And it could be delivered through a nasal or anal PCR swab. Is this why anal PCR swabs are now being introduced? The technique works better in the intestine. And so that does seem to make a really large question appear. Is this happening? Is it going to happen? And how the hell would we know if it is already happening? Are they using the PCR test to deliver the vaccine? Is that why they're keeping lists of people who are saying no to the vaccine? They don't usually do that. In fact, I've never come across it before. They're now collecting names and details of people who've declined the vaccine. Is that so that they can do a PCR test? We can't trust the government. We can't trust government advisors. We know that. We've been lied to too much. We can't trust the mainstream media because they won't tell us the truth. We definitely can't trust the BBC, which has, of course, financial links to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and which long ago betrayed us totally. We can only trust one another. Giving vaccines nasally is nothing new, of course. Children sometimes have the flu vaccine sprayed up their noses. It's a live, attenuated vaccine, by the way. Attenuated, I know, means that it's weaker, but it could still kill Granny. And personally, I might use the stuff to clear the drains, but I wouldn't squirt it up a child's nose. And you should perhaps know, nasal vaccines are already used on cattle.
We're going to hear from a person I haven't heard from before. I looked into this person's background. They've done a lot of interesting work. This is a person who is a science and medical journalist, investigative reporter, has a background in molecular biology, and she's going to give us a relatively short talk about the shaky science behind the, quote, deadly new strains. You know where they're going with the deadly new strains, don't you? Well, yes, you've had the COVID vaccine twice, but now there's a new strain and we got to give you more. And of course, then there's a new strain and we're going to give you more. And they think you're going to be, even now, Fauci and others are saying, even though you've been vaccinated twice, you still got indefinitely to wear the mask, social distance, etc. Can you see where all this is going? I know some of you do.
So I thought I'd just take a few minutes and do a video about how based in reality and hard facts is the science that's being thrown at us from public health officials about these new variants that are suddenly cropping up and around the world, in England, in the UK, in Brazil, and that they're telling us now, first they're saying, well, it's going to spread a lot more quickly, and now they're telling us not only will it spread more quickly, that it's going to be causing a lot more death, and also that now, before they were saying that these new variants are still going to be fine, that the vaccines are going to deal with them, and now they're saying, no, that won't work either. The vaccines won't work against them. So I just wanted to take a few minutes and just go through, I've written a long article that goes with this, but I wanted to go through some of the science that all of this, all these layers upon layers are built on. And those studies are primarily on one mutation that's said to be in the novel coronavirus. And that causes, now it causes to be more transmissible, to be more contagious than ever. And there are three main papers that the scientists and public health officials and politicians rely on to tell us that, it's much more transmissible. And I've got the three papers in front of me. And one of them, and the thing is, we have to ask ourselves, where were these published? Were they actually reviewed by other scientists to make sure they're accurate before they were published? And also, are they based on human people interacting with the virus, or are they based on animal studies like mice with the virus, or even farther removed, just cells from a mouse in a petri dish? And if we look at these three studies, we'll see pretty quickly that they're very far removed, unfortunately, even though the authors say, they reflect on the real virus in real situations and people. The first one is titled Adaptation of SARS-CoV-2 in bulb C mice for testing vaccine efficacy. And what this is they took the virus and they put it through a few cycles of reproducing it. And then they put it into mice, a special type of mouse. And they said, look, there's more binding, and therefore there's more binding of the virus to cells in this little model that really was divorced from reality, and therefore it's going to be more contagious, without actually going to that extra important step of saying, well, it is more contagious. Without really, yes, they didn't do that. So then let's take the next paper, and there's similar problems. This paper is called an engineered decoy receptor for SARS-CoV-2 and broadly binds protein S sequence variants. So they're taking a decoy, an engineered decoy receptor, so something that's not even real in real life. They engineered it to bind to the virus. And they're saying, oh, it binds very well. It binds a lot. So based on that, we're supposed to say, oh, that means that when we have, because in there's a particular mutation. So they're trying to have us say that, oh, when we have something that has this particular mutation that they've found, and they say it binds more closely, oh, so therefore it's more transmissible. So we kind of just have to take their word for it, because this is just an engineered decoy receptor. Again, it's not really showing anything in real life, and it's not really using proper antibodies. And then we also have a third paper called Deep Mutational Scanning of SARS-CoV-2 Receptor Binding Domain Reveals Constraints on Folding and ACE2 Binding. And so again, this is saying that we're taking a receptor binding domain. So that's just part of the virus, a little part of the virus. They're putting in a petri dish, and they're doing a whole bunch of steps that actually in this paper are very hard to follow. And they're saying, oh, look, there's more binding, and therefore the virus binds more tightly when it has this mutation, and therefore it means it's going to spread more widely. But it's very interesting. I found an article, a quotation from an article from one of the authors of this paper, Deep Mutational Binding, and in fact, from August last year, so just a few months ago. Her name is Alison Greery, and she says, well, you know, the virus as it is, the novel coronavirus without any mutations, binds quite well to this receptor in the cells. So there's no reason to believe that going beyond that level will make it more pathogenic or transmissible. And, you know, it can have a bunch of mutations that won't make any difference. So here is an author of one of these papers, new papers, that says, oh, mutations, it's going to be more transmissible, it's terrible, you know, it's going to be just spread like wildfire. And yet, here she was a few months earlier saying, no, it can bear a lot, there can be a lot of mutations that won't make any difference. So does science, biology change in a few months and make that reality different? I don't think so. It just doesn't make any sense. So, and one other thing I'll mention is these key papers on the mutations in the virus. One of them apparently makes it not work so well on what's called the PCR test, or polymerase chain reaction that's used to detect the virus. It doesn't really have as good results. It's got a negative result on one of the key parts of the PCR test. And it's this supposed change that makes it not behave as well in the PCR test, and they use that to say, oh, here's the new variant. If you look at that paper, it's from a group in France, and they found this paper itself that everything else is built on is only have from 6 PCR tests, just 6 tests, and then and that was it. And they also said, and the authors of this paper themselves, they caution, they say, however, the results should be interpreted with caution, that this mutation causes it not to show up as well on the PCR. They say it should be interpreted with caution because a limited number of samples were sequenced, so we couldn't rule out that there was actually something else causing them to be negative on this test, not this particular mutation that people are saying is in these new variants that are spreading like wildfire. So, and they also said there's another problem with these results, that we just can't take them to mean anything. And yet, so what does that mean? But yet we have these ponderous, papers that come out after that, modeling, saying, well, we know this is a problem. They have these mutations that make it more transmissible and much more contagious, and that it's a big problem. And we know it's this particular type of variant because it doesn't fully get the proper result on a PCR test. So they take it as if it's gospel. Even if you read those papers it's based on, it's saying, look, we don't really know. We're only doing this on a few numbers of patients. We need more information. But yet they take it as gospel. Like here, for example, is Public Health Ontario's analysis of the whole situation based on another mathematical model of the results. And they just take it as if, well, we know that they're very transmissible because this new variant binds more to the cells, and we know that they don't act as well on the PCR test, so that's one way we can find it. What we see is a complete divorcing of the pronouncements from the public health officials and the key scientists And now the media saying, well, we have these facts now. It's more transmissible, and we can find it, and it's spreading through the population. So it's completely divorced from reality. So now, and yet they somehow have a captive audience in the media. So people keep on believing and spewing.
So just understand the entire article, and during her reading of that, she's showing you the actual scientific article, highlighting the discrepancies. So what they actually found, and basing that upon a very, very limited, very few actual samples, and then doing a mathematical model, and we see how crazy mathematical models can be in being inaccurate, because the whole shutdown of the world's economy was based upon a grossly flawed mathematical model out of university in England, in London, and now this is just another example of that. I want to share something now from C.J. Hopkins, an award-winning playwright, novelist, and a person of great depth. And I want you to think about this for a moment. Why? Because one of the hallmarks of totalitarianism is mass conformity. Would you agree? And what happens is it almost always comes from a psychotic official narrative, not a regular official narrative, like the Cold War or the War on Terror narratives, both of which were false. I'm talking about a totally delusional official narrative that has little or no connection to reality and that is contradicted by the preponderance of actual facts. You've heard me talk about how that people within the science community of medicine working with chemotherapy have stated to me personally, top people, that chemotherapy can kill as many people as the cancer. You have to try to kill the cancer before you kill enough cells, you kill the person. And now, even with the antiretrovirals for AIDS, originally they just killed hundreds of thousands of people just in the United States alone because they started off with far too high a dose of AZT. Today you might get 50 to 100 milligrams. Then it was 1,600 milligrams. So the evidence was against using it, and yet the science showed it didn't work the way it was being promoted. So there's a disconnect between promising the world something and what they actually were using as the basis of that. I think the vaccines are part of that. So what we have here is we have, just as an example, historically, Nazism and Stalinism are the classic examples, but the phenomena is better observed in cults and other subcultural, social type of groups. Numerous examples will spring to mind. The Manson family, Jim Jones, the People's Temple, Heaven's Gate, etc. Each with its own psychotic official narrative. Helter Skelter, Christian communism, Xenu, Galactic Confederacy, and so on. So, looking in from the dominant culture, or back through time in the case, let's say of the Nazis, the delusional nature of these official narratives is glaringly obvious to most rational people, and I believe most of you are rational people. What many people fail to understand is that those who fall prey to them, whether individual cult members or entire totalitarian societies, such narratives do not register as psychotic. On the contrary, they feel entirely normal. Everything in their social reality reaffirms the narrative, and anything that challenges or contradicts it is perceived as an existential threat. Hence, people like myself or Robert Kennedy Jr., any of us who are working on looking for the truth about the safety and efficacy of vaccines are perceived as wrong by the official psychotic narrative, even though we have the actual science on our side. That's the irony of it. These narratives are invariably paranoid, portraying the cult as threatened or persecuted by an evil enemy or antagonist force which only unquestioningly questions itself to conformity to the cult's ideology, can save its members from this. It makes little difference whether this antagonist is mainstream culture, body theater, or counter-revolutionaries. The point is not the identity of the enemy. The point is the atmosphere of paranoia and hysteria the official narrative generates, which keeps the cult members or the society compliant. Now, you may think this is extreme, but I'm looking at our society today as being involved in one of two opposing cults, and they dominate the narrative and fight each other, like D'Angelo's concept that everyone born Caucasian, no matter what their background or family dynamics historically, you're a racist. Well, that's a cult thinking. That's not real. It's not based on anything. And yet others who will feel persecuted or threatened by a word, a statement, the color of your skin, your social position, will now feel that they are justified. So in addition to being paranoid, these narratives are often internally inconsistent, illogical, and well, just completely ridiculous. This does not weaken them, as you might suspect. Actually, it increases their power, as it forces their adherents to attempt to reconcile their inconsistencies and irrationalities, and in many cases, utter absurdity, in order to remain in good standing with the cult. That's the media. Do you not believe that the major social forums, from Wikipedia to Google and Facebook, do you not believe that they have not been influenced by the media saying, you do not want these people on your forum? If you allow these people to talk about 5G, to talk about GMOs, to talk about the vaccines or COVID, then you're to blame. You're spreading propaganda that can kill millions of people. Of course that's going to influence them. So you have a reinforcing double negative outcome. So that's where we're at today. Moreover, cult leaders will often radically change these narratives for no apparent reason, forcing their cult members to abruptly forswear or even to denounce as heresy the beliefs they had previously been forced to profess. Weapons of mass destruction is a good example. We didn't really, believe that. Well, of course you did, because you didn't propose it and you supported it. And this is just this mindlessly parroting, just nonsensical gibberish. And the media are filled with cult leaders. They take themselves way too seriously. Also, the cult leaders' nonsensical gibberish is not as nonsensical as it may seem at first. Why? They're clever. Upon encountering such gibberish, assume that the cult leader is trying to communicate and that something is very wrong with his brain. The cult leader isn't trying to communicate. He's trying to disorient and control the listener's minds. Listen to Charlie Manson's rapping, not just to what he says, but how he says it. Note how he sprinkles tiny bits of truth into his stream of free associated nonsense and his repetitive use of thought-terminating cliches. That's how it works. If all this sounds familiar, good, because the same techniques that most cult leaders use to control minds of the members of their cults are used by totalitarian systems to control the minds of entire societies. Milieu control, loaded language, sacred science, demand of purity, and other standard mind-controlling techniques. It can happen to pretty much any society, just as anyone can fall prey to a cult given the right set of circumstances. It is happening to most of our societies right now. An official narrative is being implemented, a totalitarian official narrative, a totally psychotic official narrative, no less delusional than that of the Nazis or the Manson family or any other cult. Most people cannot see that. It is happening for the simple reason that it is happening to them. They are literally unable to recognize it. The human mind is extremely resilient and inventive when it is pushed past its limit. Ask anyone who has struggled with psychosis or has taken LSD. We do not recognize when we are going insane. When reality falls apart completely, the mind will create a delusional narrative which appears just as real as our normal reality, because even a delusion is better than the stark raving terror of utter chaos. This is what totalitarians and cult leaders count on, and they exploit this by implanting their narratives in our minds. and why actual initiation rituals, as opposed to purely symbolic rituals, begin by attacking the subject's mind with terror, pain, physical exhaustion, psychiatric drugs, or some other drugs, as a means of obliterating the subject's perception of reality. What happens when you're taking Paxil, Prozac, Zoloft? Well, why don't you ask the 22 to 24 vets who put a gun in their mouth and blow their brains out every 24 hours, over 160,000, yet not a single question has been asked, how did they get to that place? What went on in their mind that disconnected them from the actual reality they had before they went into the deconditioning process of going into a war zone? We never asked those questions, because then we would have to ask, why are we in these wars? What is the consequence to the people fighting them and the people that we're killing? Once that is achieved and the subject's mind starts desperately trying to construct a new narrative to make sense out of the cognitive chaos and psychological trauma, and it is a relatively easy guide that processes and implants whatever narrative you want. Now we've got the narrative, vaccinate, it's the only way. And then when they come up with an expensive drug that actually works, the drug, they won't tell you about building up your immune system. They won't tell you about drugs that work now, like ivermectin or any of the hydroxychloroquine. No. Eating a better diet? No. Getting over your comorbidities? No. That would make too much sense. That's something you don't have to have agree to understand. And this is why so many people who are able to easily recognize totalitarianism in cults in foreign countries can never perceive the totalitarianism that is taking shape now. You see it everywhere you look, every broadcast out there, including on some liberal radio stations. It's there. The journalists, it's there. The ones who no longer are willing to abide by it, like Matt Taibbi and Tucker Carlson just had on Glenn, and I'm going to play a clip of that tomorrow so you can hear what a real journalist, when looking at totalitarianism, has to say. And he's been excluded because of that. They have been successfully initiated into a cult otherwise, which is essentially what totalitarianism is, albeit on a societal scale. In conclusion, their initiation into the COVIDian cult began in January, when the medical authorities and the corporate media turned on the fear with projections of hundreds of millions of deaths and fake photos of people dropping dead in the streets. The psychological conditioning has continued to right up till now. The global masses have been subjected to a constant stream of propaganda, manufactured hysteria, wild speculation, conflicting directives, exaggeration, lies, tawdry theatrical effects, lockdowns, emergency-filled hospitals and morgues, the singing, dancing, National Health Services staff, death trucks, overflowing ICUs, dead COVID babies, manipulated statistic, goon squads, masks. 8 months later, here we are. The head of the health emergency program at the World Health Organization has basically confirmed that the overall death rate per year is 0.1%, approximately the same as the seasonal flu. And here's the people that we're vaccinating. We're having wear masks, now triple masks. 1 year to 19 years of age, 99.997% will not die. Ages 20 to 49, 99.98%. Ages 50 to 69, 99.5%. 70 years, 94.6%. The science argument is officially over. An increasing number of doctors and medical experts, as I've mentioned many times, are breaking ranks and explaining how the current mass hysteria over cases, which now includes perfectly healthy people who test positive on a fraudulent study, is essentially meaningless propaganda. All right? And then there is the existence of Sweden and other countries which are not playing ball with the official COVID-19 narrative, which makes a mockery of the ongoing hysteria. So every day I can debunk many aspects of the official narrative, but I cannot challenge, nor can I change, nor can I even get a word that a person within the cult of the establishment, either Democrat or Republican, corporate or journalistic, will accept. Only those who still have yet to become members of the cult understand everyone out there is now part of the COVIDian cultist. And they were wrong about this virus. And yet they still are in control, and we're still following him. I wish I could be more optimistic, and maybe some sort of plan of action. But the only historical parallel I can think of is how Christianity converted the pagan world, which doesn't really bode so well for us. I'm Gary Null. I want to thank you all for listening, and I especially want to thank C.J. Hopkins for his deep insights on this topic. Oh, by the way, I'm going over to our sister station, WBI, now to help them out, help them raise a little money. And we did have some calls. I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to get to it. I'll get to those tomorrow. But we did have Jeff from Portland, Maine. Jeff, are you still there? Yes? No?
Good morning. I was just my mother's in a senior housing facility, and they're gearing up for the vaccine there. I was wondering, is there any sources where you can produce some current information on injuries and mortality from the vaccine, especially for senior citizens?
Yes, all you have to... Okay, yeah, Jeff, I got to go, but here's what you should do. Both Germany and France have stopped giving any vaccines, these COVID vaccines, to any people over the age of 65. I think that you should look at the scientific literature that the French government and the German government produced, because that's your answer. All right, see you all tomorrow. Have a nice day.